So I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of background about how this all started. It's actually kind of embarrassing. I went to a Pechakucha at downtown at the Vogue, and someone talked about Habitat Forum, and I had no idea that it happened. And as someone who is young and progressive and active in the scene, I was like, oh, well, what other stories haven't I heard? What are those untold stories of the progressive movement, and why do they always just kind of go by the wayside? And so Kev talked a little bit about that, but we wanted to share some of the stories and uncover some of those stories that are told. And the really powerful thing about stories are that they connect to all of us, and they make all of these problems that are way out there, climate change, the environmental and economic crisis, inequality, it makes all of those things become personal, and that there's something in here as well. And so stories can also do this really amazing thing where they build a set of values that we want to move forward on. So if we create these values, we can start shifting this public narrative that we want to be a part of. And so we can create a story as a collective and also feel like we have our own individual piece within that. So that's a little bit about the stories and why we decided to go with that format. So maybe we should hear some? Okay. So our first storyteller is Rudi Krauss. Rudi was born in Germany, but he grew up in Vancouver, and he lived here for most of his life. He had a little detour in the Okanagan for 13 years, but he's back here now. Local food was part of his childhood, and we heard that he grew meat rabbits, but maybe he'll talk a bit more about that in the city, which is pretty cool. But I think he was doing local food before they called it local food, and it was probably just food. Rudi, when we asked him about a few things to say about himself, he said that it was really important for him to know his city and to be really active within that city. And so this just kind of shows his sense of responsibility and care. And he said he wanted to be part of the regeneration of this city. He's now a retired teacher and has worked many other jobs, including construction, small business owner, an orchardist. And he has 5 children and 7 grandchildren. So his family is still living on through this. So we can welcome Rudi up to the stage.
Always have a prop. The best way to engage an audience is to ask them to use their imagination. So this represents planet Earth. I don't own a globe, so I went and bought a beach ball. My grandchildren can play with it. I dedicate this talk to 3 people, my 2 parents, Samuel and Emmy, and to my friend Nicole, who made me aware of this event, regeneration, and I was here last time. In the last decades, there has been a lot of talk about living locally, but thinking globally, about the way that we live locally and how that affects the whole planet. We can't help but live locally, but we can choose to live well locally. We can't help affecting other people and other places around the world and be affected by what happens in other parts of our planet. But we can choose to do so mindfully and well, at least as much as we are able to. I'd like to pull a few threads from the tapestry of my story to illustrate some of this, local, global. My grandfather began his life in the northeastern part of Germany. In the final years of the 19th century, he and his young family relocated to Ukraine, where rich farmland was available. In 1907, the year my father was born, he was the 4th of 10 surviving children, the family relocated once more to Siberia, where land was even more plentiful and cheaper. There they engaged in mixed farming until 1930, when the government confiscated their land, their buildings, their machinery, their animals, and they returned to Germany with only their personal belongings in a few suitcases. My father was 23. He and his younger brother started a grocery business which lasted until the Second World War. They were both drafted, survived the war, and ended up in the western part of the now divided country. Life was hard. Jobs were scarce. I was born 2 years after the war. In the early 50s, we moved in with my maternal grandparents, who lived above about their dry goods store in a very large old house. Behind the house was a large garden, and now we can have the first pictures, with flowers, vegetables, and berries, and the neighbors kept chickens. So in this picture, which is not very clear, but right at the bottom, there's me and my sister, and we're picking gooseberries. And in the other picture, my two sisters, and the reason I'm holding my nose is it's because the chickens are behind us. In 1954, my parents chose to emigrate to Canada. We landed in Quebec City, traveled by train across the country, and settled first in the Fraser Valley, where we raised chickens, and spent the summer working on a farm picking berries and beans. Beans, we were given 2 cents a pound. Can you imagine? In the winter, we moved into Vancouver. My father always had a garden where he grew both flowers and vegetables. The first year in Vancouver, we also raised rabbits and then ate them. My sisters and I were enlisted to help with weeding and picking. So gardening has always been a taken-for-granted reality in my life. When I got married in 1970, my wife and I started a little garden in our first rental place. We've always had a garden wherever we lived. I learned how to prune fruit trees in one place. And for 7 years, I kept bees in our backyard. Like me, our children grew up with the reality of gardening, designing and making a garden, keeping and enjoying all that a garden can provide. One daughter ended up studying horticulture and now has her own business designing and maintaining gardens. 4 of my 5 children are involved in some aspect of gardening. In the early 90s, our family moved from a big house on a small property in Surrey to a small house, really a cottage, in a Lakeview orchard in the Okanagan. We grew and sold soft fruits, mainly peaches, but also added a large garden. And now we can have the next picture. That's the garden. The view from our house down the slope, and you can see some of the fruit trees here. And then the next picture, we also, to honor my father's vision, grew flowers as well. We don't only feed our bodies, we need to feed our souls as well, and that's where the flowers come in. This is a little desert garden with some local plants. 7 years ago, I moved back to Vancouver to be near my children and grandchildren, into a ground-level apartment where I now grow a few things in containers. But I found ways to get dirt under my fingernails in my friends' gardens and in my children's gardens, helping them. And then for the past 4 years, actually it's now entering the 5th year, I've worked together with several young adults in urban farming over in the Victoria First Avenue area. Next picture, that's outside my place in Kerrisdale. And then one more. And that's one of the gardens in East Vancouver. Tomatoes, squashes. Now my grandchildren come and visit me and help me harvest the food I've grown. So this story is now in its 5th generation. Regeneration, generation. It is important not only to eat and enjoy locally grown food over shared meals, to remember the stories which have shaped who we are, to listen to the stories of our neighbors, and then to help the next generation enter the future by grounding them in the past. And as Deanna already said, it's become my calling to live well in the city, including growing food, but also to learn to live in well and love the city that I've chosen to live in, and then to help others to love this city well too. Thank you. Yep.